Hi, this is Leo Laporte. We have a great guest for you this week on Triangulation. Ed Niedermeyer is an auto writer, a podcaster. He covers cars, and he's just published a new book all about Tesla from the beginning to now. What a story. Ludicrous coming up next.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 409, recorded Friday, August 9th, 2019. Ludicrous, the unvarnished story of Tesla Motors. It's time for Triangulation. That's the show where we get together with some of the most interesting people in technology, spend an hour really getting to know their story. Of course, Triangulation is multi-hosted by our hosts at Twit, including Denise Howell, Jason Howell, no relation. Micah Sargent is going to be doing Triangulations too, one of our newest hosts, and our brand new host, Ant Pruitt. And we're looking forward to his contributions to the show. So it's kind of a rotating roster. I insisted on being on today's show, though, because our guest is Edward Niedermeyer. He writes about cars, automobiles, vehicles, and is the author of a new book about Tesla called Ludicrous, the unvarnished story of Tesla Motors. It comes out August 20th, although I'm told you could probably get it right now if you hustle over to Amazon. Hardcover and Kindle versions. Are you going to do an Audible version? First of all, welcome, Ed. Nice to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. An audiobook version is in the works. I've been told it'll be out around August 20th, maybe a little afterwards, but yeah, it's happening.
So you're a brave fellow. I'm really glad that you began the book with a story about your background, so we kind of understand that you're a traditional automotive writer. In fact, took over your dad's newsletter, very famous automotive newsletter, and was editor-in-chief there. So you're what my friend Sam Abul-Samid calls a metal bender.
Yeah, that is how I got my start. It wasn't my dad's. My dad worked for the website. It was called The Truth About Cars. It was actually founded by a guy called Robert Frago. And its sort of main claim to fame was covering the Detroit automakers. They had a GM Death Watch and a Chrysler Death Watch, Ford Death Watch. And I left school in 2008 and frankly, really couldn't get a job doing anything like waiting tables or anything. My dad said, hey, they're looking for someone to do some news blogging on this site. You want to do it? And, I had always been exposed. My dad's a huge car guy. And so I'd always been exposed to it, but it wasn't really my background. But I kind of realized pretty quickly that it's a fascinating subject. It's something that, people don't pay attention to enough. Cars are really an important part of our economy and material culture or whatever.
I'm from California. This is car culture country. I mean, that's really it, man,
Yeah. And I think, as I mentioned in the book, I think the main takeaway that I got from starting, especially in 2008, is that just the car industry is brutally hard.
I was fascinated. Once you started writing about it, I realized, of course, you're planning a product 5 years ahead of time. You have no idea what the demand's going to be. It's hugely capital intensive, and it's completely possible to lose your shirt look at the Edsel, for instance, with one wrong turn. And of course, by the time you were writing about it, all three of the big automakers in Detroit were about to go under or close to bankruptcy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's also an incredibly competitive business. People like to say that there's not really innovation in the auto industry. And in fact, there aren't quantum leaps, right? It's a relatively mature class of products, but it's also incredibly competitive. And the changes are going on constantly. You have to kind of run to stand still in the business. And you need a lot of scale. And with scale comes complexity. And so it's an insanely difficult business. And it's been around for 100 years. And literally thousands of companies have not made it. They've gone out of business. Right. And I think people tend to think of the auto industry as being sort of, slow moving dinosaurs. And they are slow moving, but not because they're dumb, but because that's what's proven over 100 years of competitive pressure of evolution, of survival of the fittest, like moving slow has proven to have real advantages. And so, the Tesla story was so fascinating to me, has always been fascinating to me, because it's the first time someone has come in and said, let's do a car with sort of a software startup style company, right? With that kind of culture. And basically the premise of the book is that that experience, has been very successful at some things. I think a lot of people are very familiar with the things that Tesla's been successful about. They're good at getting that into the media. But there's also been a lot of things that they really haven't done well. And that is a product of the kind of culture they've brought to the business, among some other factors. And I think it's really important that we learn the lessons from that experience, what's worked and what hasn't, because the auto industry and the tech sector are going to converge more and more. And it's important to understand sort of, what do tech companies do well? What do car companies do well? And they are very different.
It was really an opportunity for Elon Musk, who had made his first fortune as one of the founders of PayPal. And around 2008, as a couple of things are going on, gas prices are going through the roof, car companies are struggling, he saw an opportunity to make an electric vehicle. But electric vehicles aren't anything new. The first automobiles in the 1910s were electric vehicles. What happened that we abandoned electricity, went to gas, and then, very famously, GM had its EV1, and you talk about that in the book a little bit. And of course, there's that great documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, where people wanted this vehicle. And GM not only stopped leasing it, they crushed all the remaining vehicles. What happened? Why aren't all cars electric?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that, battery technology really hasn't, in terms of lead acid batteries,
the early ones were lead acid, right?
Yeah, and from 1910 until really the 90s, when you had some new, nickel cadmium and nickel metal hydride sort of chemistries, and eventually lithium ion, that was really the first time that you had batteries that were sort of a real step up from those lead acid. And while sort of battery technology languished for the better part of a century, internal combustion engine technology went crazy. It made massive leaps, and continues to. Like, people don't realize how much more sophisticated gas engines have become. And I think in general with cars, people take them for granted in a lot of different ways. And I think in large part because, it's Detroit in the 50s and 60s was like Silicon Valley now, where it had all this cultural power, and it inspired people about the future, and it showed them what the future could be like. It really was what Silicon Valley is now, but it's lost that mojo over the last 50 years. Now I think the tech sector, Elon Musk, I think what's fascinating about Tesla is that they've stepped in and showed, car companies can still do this. They can still show you what the future is going to look like. And I think that's why it resonated. It was something that we sort of had a maybe cultural memory of. But the EV1 is, I mean, there's a great book called The Car That Could that really goes into it. That was a complicated situation. The way that car was designed, I think it's my personal opinion is that it was unlikely that it could have been financially viable. It wasn't, certainly in the way it was executed. And I think the reality is that electric cars have been very popular with certain demographics.
A narrow slice, yes.
If you look at vehicle sales in the U.S., people say, oh, Tesla's the future, electric cars are the future. And I believe those things. I certainly want to believe those things. But if you look at sales, the bigger trend than gas to electric is cars to SUVs and pickup trucks.
Which is bizarre, but that's because gas prices started going down. They tumbled, and people bought bigger cars all of a sudden. They said, oh, it's cheap again. Because we are not a long-term planning society. We just go, oh, what's the price at the pump? All right, I'm getting an SUV.
Yep. Americans love value. Cars have been associated with freedom.
Well,
for a long
that's
time.
a big part of it, isn't it? It's psychology as well, isn't it? Yeah.
We have decades of marketing that have associated cars with certain values, and electric cars don't necessarily fit into those values.
So the year that movie came out, 2006, interestingly, Elon Musk wrote his secret plan, and his secret plan was published worldwide.
Right.
tell us about the secret plan.
So, I mean, in essence, it was a blog post, and it basically laid out the strategy that I think a lot of people associate with Tesla, which was, we're going to start out with this expensive sports car. Then we're going to use the profits from that to develop a vehicle that's, a lot bigger volume and a lot lower price.
The Model S.
They said about double the volume. Yeah, this would be Model S. Double the volume and half the price is what it was supposed to be. Did not quite work out that way. And then it would continue to sort of double in volume and have roughly in price, with each subsequent model. What's interesting about it is that, for me, I think this is the moment where Tesla took one of several really pivotal moments for Tesla, because this was it came out right after they came out of stealth mode and they were showing the Roadster for the first time. And there had been some media coverage, particularly in the New York Times, 2 stories that had really irked Elon Musk, because Martin Eberhard, who was one of the original sort of 2 founders, Elon is also a founder now because of a subsequent lawsuit, but it really started with 2 people. And Martin Eberhard, who was the CEO initially, got all this attention. And in the first New York Times story, Elon Musk wasn't mentioned at all. In the second one, he was sort of like, is the money guy or whatever, barely mentioned. And there are emails where Elon Musk was extremely upset about this. And within a few weeks, he put out this blog post. And what it does is it established him as sort of this central figure to Tesla.
Mastermind, the evil genius behind Tesla.
And that's just, started off this sort of direction that's kind of continued and accelerated ever since.
Speaking as a former Tesla owner, and I'll give you full disclosure in a second, I found the Manifesto inspiring because it isn't merely to build an electric car and then another electric car that's cheaper and another electric car that's even cheaper, but it's also to provide zero-emission electric power generation options. It is ultimately, and maybe this is hindsight, but to solve the climate crisis by eliminating gas vehicles. And as somebody who says that's a great thing, I drank the Kool-Aid. I bought right into it. I bought a Model X, actually, I should go back because a good friend of mine, Jason Calacanis, has Roadster 1, and I've ridden in his Roadster. Jason is a cheerleader for Elon and a friend of Elon's, and I drank the Kool-Aid. I said, this is great. As soon as I can afford one, I will get one. And I bought a Model X, almost one of the first off the line, July of 3 years ago. So what is that, 2016? And but I leased it because my wife said, you can't trust that battery. There'll be, and she was right in one respect, there'll be better ones coming out the year after, the year after, the year after. You don't want to own it more than 3 years. She was right. I just turned in my Model X, and I am probably not going to buy another Tesla, but we did buy a Bolt.
Okay.
And I think the Bolt exists to some degree because of Tesla. Isn't that correct? It also exists because of Carb.
Yes, absolutely.
Carb's a big player in this. Talk about Carb.
Well, but before we get to that, just on the master plan part, I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating to me is that yeah, so the idea was, we don't want to sell toys to rich people. We want to, sell something to wealthy people so we can fund and, and like you say, sort of solve the entire problem.
And I was glad to buy Ludicrous Mode at $10,000, not because I needed it, because I felt like it was literally in my mind a donation.
Yes. And I think that's one of the really interesting things is that Tesla has not really delivered. Certainly the master plan has not played out the way Elon Musk laid it out, right? Their second car, the Model S, average transaction price for that was right about $100,000, which was basically the same as the Roadster. Third car, Model X, about $100,000 average transaction price.
Mine was 120. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Because I got all the bells and whistles. Yeah. Exactly. I paid extra for red brake calipers.
So
talk about drinking the Kool-Aid.
The crazy thing is that the plan was a failure, but the mission has succeeded. And I think that's the interesting part about this is that Tesla has had a real impact, not just on the market and perceptions, but on the industry itself as well. I think
so, yes.
Simply by selling the expensive cars. And their culture is set up much better to be a small volume, purveyor of high-end cars, basically Silicon Valley, Ferrari. Or, that is the business that I think that they can make work. And they haven't done it because of this like messianic vision. And the tragedy of it is that I think, they can really, they have made a great impact in what they're trying to accomplish, on that big scale, without having to sell cars to everybody and at every price point. And I think the Model 3 now is showing that selling affordable cars to the mass market is a very different business than selling small volumes of premium cars. And it's much harder, and their culture is really not set up for it. And they've already said at this point they're not gonna go really any cheaper. There's been mixed signals about that, but I would not expect a Tesla to ever be cheaper than the cheapest Model 3 right now.
So what's great about this story, we're talking with Ed Niedermeyer. He's the author of a new book about Tesla called Ludicrous. What's great about this story is there's really two tracks. There's a grand sociological track to this, and changing times, changing culture, changing needs, Silicon Valley. And then there's also this great man psychological track, because Elon is such a study in contradictions. I don't know what. In fact, I'm going to ask you a little bit about this. But on the sociological side, it was the California Admissions Board, Carb, that really set the stage for electric vehicles to start being economically, maybe not viable, but something the car companies had to make.
Yeah, and one of the great ironies is that the car companies have basically been subsidizing Tesla because of Carb, right? People think of Carb a lot of times as being, a taxpayer subsidy. And really what it is if you don't sell enough electric cars, you pretty much have to buy credits from Tesla.
Huh.
And so the
Nice.
car companies have actually been the ones who have been subsidizing Tesla. And I think now, ironically, one of the reasons that more of them are making electric cars, it's as much, they need to do it anyway. They know that, and the market is sort of slowly but steadily moving in that direction. But I think they're sick of signing these checks to Tesla. I think that's a real part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, so Carb is kind of in a way how I got into this story, really the book, because they had given Tesla basically sort of double the credits, which really can amount to, it's hard to say for sure what Tesla sold those credits for, but I think clearly in the tens of millions and up to the hundreds of millions of dollars. They were getting double the credits for doing this battery swap system, which turns out to have been basically a facade.
They never
it
did.
Wasn't,
I remember seeing the videos. I thought, oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So, it's funny because Tesla has said subsequently that, I've been, on a jihad against them since 2008, which is absolutely not true. In 2014, I had lunch at their headquarters with one of their top executives. And I saw Elon's, workspace and but they said this. And the reality is that it was this battery swap thing that really sucked me in. I had been fascinated with an Israeli company called Project Better Place that was doing battery swap. And when they said that they were opening this up, I was really excited. And after about 5 months of them saying that it was available and people were theoretically using it, I couldn't find any reports of people using it. So I went down to Harris Ranch, where it was, which is halfway between San Francisco and LA. I spent 4 days and it didn't get used once. It was a busy holiday weekend. And what did happen was that they brought in extra superchargers because there were lines at the superchargers, right? And it takes 45 minutes, say, to charge. And if there's two people in front of you in line, each one of them takes 45 minutes and it gets really inconvenient. They brought in extra superchargers instead of opening this battery swap station that they said was open and hooked these superchargers up to diesel generators. And that was sort of the moment.
That's terrible.
That was sort of the moment where I was like, not only are they saying that they have this technology that's not really real apparently, or it's not what they claim it is, but then they're also willing to, do stuff like hook, cars up to diesel generators. When you see something like that, you kind of start to think, wait a second, if a company is willing to do that, what else are they willing to do? And sure enough, there's never just one cockroach. And the more I dug into Tesla, that was the point at which I said, there's got to be more here. And so I really started digging into the story. And what I found, I've been writing online, since 2014, 2015, and now it's in the book.
Well, okay, let me unpack a lot of the things we just talked about, because if you don't drive an electric vehicle, you may not be familiar with all of the issues involved. And of course, one of the reasons a lot of people don't drive electric vehicles is range anxiety. There's gas stations everywhere. You never worry about running out of gas and saying, what am I going to do now? But there aren't charging stations everywhere. That's part of the problem. Elon's cars have always had a lot of range, much more than the competitors until recently. My Model X had over 250-mile range. So, but you still have that problem after 250 miles. Now what? So they built the supercharger network that is a high-speed, high voltage charging network. And that was a brilliant idea. They were exclusive to Tesla. You couldn't use your Chevy Bolt. You can't charge it there. It was exclusive to Tesla, and that was actually the thing that put me over the top, is when they put a supercharger in our neck of the woods. But this idea of, what if instead of charging the car, you drove up, the battery in the car, the entire battery was taken out, a different fully charged battery was put in a battery swap station. Seemed like a clever idea. Now, this Israeli startup, Better Place, went bankrupt trying to make it work.
They did, and they actually even had a more sort of sophisticated approach where it wasn't just solving the charging problem. You didn't even get batteries
with the car.
Yeah, that's the thing. They would sell you the electric car with no battery, and so you could buy the car itself for $20,000, and then you just had sort of it was like a cell phone plan, right?
Yeah.
And you would buy however many miles a month or whatever. But yeah, it fell apart for a whole bunch of reasons. But the idea of it was so brilliant that it really captured my imagination.
It's a great idea, yeah. There's the issue of who owns the batteries, and so Better Place made more sense than Tesla.
Exactly.
Because that's my battery, and I'm going to give you, and then you're going to give me, and is this battery going to be any good? And there's all
how's it been treated?
Yeah, how's it been treated? There's all sorts of issues, and I can understand why it ultimately didn't fly.
Yeah.
The good news is, again, thanks to Tesla, the charging issue is kind of resolved, because VW, in its Dieselgate settlement, agreed to spend $2 billion and put chargers in all over the United States in a company called Electrify America, and these are CCS fast chargers. Yep. So you could start to see an electric future where there are chargers everywhere in the same way there are gas stations everywhere. There's still that disadvantage. You could fill up a tank in a few minutes. It's going to take you an hour to charge up your car, but they're often near a Wendy's. You go, you have a hamburger, and then you get back on the road. It's never been a problem. It was never a problem for me. And I have to tell you, as somebody who, once I drove an electric car, I never want to drive a gasoline car again. They're not only more fun to drive, but they're almost maintenance-free. These electric engines are much simpler than gasoline engines. Much simpler. If you ever see the schematic of the two, it's insane how complicated a gas vehicle is. There's no transmission on an electric car. There's no oil changes. There's no tune-ups. It's an electric motor. And so it seems like a better technology, to be honest.
Yeah, and the irony is that yeah, I mean, you're right. Conceptually, electric cars should be much more low maintenance. They are much more simple mechanically, although there are actually companies working on transmissions. Tesla was not able to do a 2-speed transmission for their Roadster, but there are companies who think they can do it now.
But I never felt the need for a transmission. I guess people like sticks. I don't know. What do you want a transmission for? It's forward and backward.
Yeah, it operates a little more efficiently. And the thing is, so the Tesla, right? The reason the Teslas are so popular, they really made EVs so popular, is because they threw a lot of batteries at the problem. Right. So, and that's why they're expensive.
Right.
They're expensive cars. Not everyone can afford them, and there's a lot of batteries. And frankly, if we replaced every car on the road with a Tesla, there's not enough cobalt in the world. There's not enough of a lot of minerals, or not enough supply of that to make the supply chain work. At this point.
That's part of the problem, is we're still stuck with these primitive battery technologies. Lithium-ion made it possible, but it's still problematic in the long run.
Well, and ironically, too, Tesla is a very futuristic company, obviously in a lot of ways, and forward-looking. But also, I mean, their cars are very American, like traditionally American in ways. They're big, they're wide, they're heavy, they're powerful.
Yeah.
These are like, ironically, right, and they have overkill range, and I think overkill is also sort of a recurring theme in American cars.
Yes.
And the reality is that who really drives 100 miles, in a day?
I never had a problem.
How often?
Yeah.
And the thing is, Americans have are every household basically has 2 cars. There's basically more cars than people in this country. And so you can have one electric car with 100 miles of range that's quite affordable, that takes care of 90% of your use cases, and then have an SUV or something, maybe a plug-in hybrid or a hybrid or something that, that 10% of the time when you have to, go skiing at the mountain or go out to the middle of nowhere to go camping or whatever, then you take that. And I think that, one of the risks of Tesla is that sort of because they've had this success, particularly with an affluent, sort of influential market, that everyone's going to just do the same thing. And the reality is that electric cars, don't all need to be Teslas in order to have better market success than they've had so far.
Honestly, in almost every respect, the Bolt is a better car at a quarter of the price.
Really?
Yeah.
You don't hear that a lot, but I'm curious, like what makes you?
The range is 230 miles. It's a smaller car, which frankly, you're right, makes a lot more sense. The SUV, the Falcon doors, give me a break. That my wife always felt like we were driving around in a beta version of a vehicle. And this is that software culture you talked about. Your Tesla gets updates weekly. And in fact, there have been complaints. There's a guy suing Tesla right now because a software update reduced his range.
Yep. And yeah, no, you're absolutely right. They have a minimum viable product, which in an industry that spends 5 years, and it's like the car industry is such a measure twice, cut once business. They would rather take 3 months or delay, a launch 6 months or whatever to work out problems, because once you start manufacturing something, in order to do that efficiently, you want to make each one as similar to the next, right? Quality in manufacturing means, if you build 3 things, they're as similar as possible, right? And a defect is anything that differentiates one product from another.
Each Tesla is a unique little snowflake.
and
I happen to get a good snowflake, but there were many people who did not. In fact, before I picked mine up at the factory, I downloaded from Reddit a checklist of things to check on fit and finish before you take that car.
Yep.
And the reason I didn't get another Tesla is because of a parts issue. It turns out if you broke a windshield or you had a part problem, their supply chain is so wonky that you could be waiting months. You could be waiting months to get your windshield replaced.
Yeah.
That makes no sense. Plus, the front tire size was different from the back tire size, so you couldn't rotate the tires. Yep. So I went through 3 sets of tires in 15,000 miles. Yeah. I mean, I can go on and on. It's a minimal viable product. It's very much a software mentality of get it out the door and we could tweak it, we can make it better. And as a technologist, I didn't mind that. But my wife, who is a car person, she said, well, this is crazy. This is a beta test. You're driving a beta test. The car went forward and was supposed to go backward. We first got it. We called them up. They said, no, let me look at the log. No, you were in forward. That was a little scary. They knew every button press, they had logged it all. And then literally the next day they called up and said, we've got a feature in here now where if you press and hold the brake pedal, it'll put on the e-brake so you won't roll. And it was like they fixed it.
Yeah.
They did a push to software fix.
Yep. And that's great for the stuff that you can fix with software.
But you can't finish.
Yeah. Well, and lots of things, right? So the Model 3, for example, and this hasn't really been widely reported, but they launched it in July or August of 2017. In January of 2018, they put out this, it's called a technical service bulletin, which basically means, here's something that needs to be fixed, but it's not safety related, so we're not doing a recall. And all the TSB says is we've developed a new motor for the Model 3 that meets our standards for performance and quality. And you're like, wait a second, you've been selling a car for 7 months, 8 months with a motor that didn't meet your own standards on a design level? That's not even a manufacturing quality problem. We didn't have the design baked yet when we took this car to market. And again, manufacturing is not all the same. You can make certain things sort of with some version of that, but like cars are literally the most complicated consumer good of all. I'm sure people could quibble, but like that is built at the scale that it's built at, right? We buy 17 million of these things a year in the US, and each one of them has thousands of parts. And to operate efficiently, and I mentioned this in the book, at car companies, they actually have a thing. This is the Toyota production system innovated this. It's called the end-on, and it's a cord on the assembly line that you pull if you see something that goes wrong. And it brings any line worker can bring the entire factory to a stop. And what they do is they do a root cause analysis on it, and then they fix not just the problem, they fix the cause of the problem upstream, whatever caused it. And not until they've done that do they restart production again. And the reason is because the only way to make these things efficiently is using standardized processes on a really well-developed production system assembly line.
That's Henry Ford's innovation, right?
Well, no, so that's actually, this is actually Toyota production system
but
innovation.
this is their, improvement,
So
but
he
over
had-
the assembly line. I agree.
He
Yes,
had the
yes.
assembly, right? He had the moving assembly line,
Yeah.
but he was focused on just efficient, moving things as fast as possible. He was
Right.
cranking stuff out as fast as possible. That was sort of the first manufacturing sort of movement in the car business.
But wasn't the assembly line also about producing a consistent product, mass production of a consistent product each time?
It was, yes. So standardized parts was part of that. And
Because
Henry Ford
every
kept
car
it-
before that was hand built, like a bicycle.
But Henry Ford also kept it simple because like the vehicles almost didn't change at all. They were all really standardized.
Right.
And as cars got more complicated and market demanded more variation, that's when the Toyota production system really came in and they realized, it's much more, you really have to focus on quality more than cranking stuff out because these things are so complicated. If you have to go in once it goes off the assembly line and fix it, and Tesla's done a ton of this. They have a whole, reworking and remanufacturing operations, some of which have been massive. And it's so fundamentally inefficient to have a human go in, figure out what the problem is, and then fix it themselves in non-standardized processes, not even using processes. And so, at a traditional car company, post this sort of Toyota production system revolution, like I said, they would rather shut down the entire factory and not make any cars than make cars with even relatively small defects that you have to then fix sort of manually and in a non-standardized way.
We're talking to Ed Niedermeyer, his new book. I would hold it up, but I don't have a copy. I only have a PDF, but it's really a good read. It's Ludicrous, the Unvarnished Story of Tesla Motors. It comes out technically August 20th, although I think you can at least
Amazon's
pre-order.
been shipping.
Amazon's been shipping. Damn them. Actually, it's great. I'm so glad they are. I will get myself a hardcover as soon as I can. It's really interesting to see how the world divides between Tesla fans and Tesla enemies. And I have to say I'm a Tesla fan in the sense that I really support the vision and the idea, and I think we need to move in this direction. And I love electric vehicles. I just really do. But you said something interesting. Not many Bolt people are Bolt fans. But I am, because I'm an electric vehicle fan, and I was very impressed that for $30,000 after all the government rebates, by the way, $10,000 in government rebates on this vehicle, $30,000 compared to $120,000, it was 80% of, it didn't have autopilot, but maybe that's not a bad thing. It was 80% of what that Model X was. And it certainly felt more reliable, and it felt like it was made by an actual car company instead of a startup out of Silicon Valley. But I don't know. I straddle the line because, a lot of times Tesla fans will call anybody that says anything negative, including you, a short. Oh, you must be shorting the stock. You're trying to take us down, man. And they don't really tolerate criticism well. And that starts right at the top with Elon. He doesn't want to hear any criticism at all. Your relationship got sour pretty quick when they found out you were writing this, right?
Even before. So in 2016, actually right after I officially decided I was gonna write a book about Tesla, I had a story come out, and the short version is Tesla was doing repairs of defective parts, including some suspensions that were breaking, and in order to get free or discounted repairs, you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And
let me say once again what you just said, because that's stunning. If you wanted to get a free fix of their broken part, the thing they'd misdesigned in the first place, you had to sign an NDA, so that no one would know that part was broken.
Yeah, and it was a sweeping NDA. You couldn't discuss what went wrong, how they fixed it, or that you even signed the agreement.
It's unheard of.
It's certainly in the car business, it's 100% unheard of. And the reason that was a really big problem is that NHTSA, the safety regulator, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, they rely on two sources of data basically to make sure the cars are safe. One source is the car company itself. They want to self-report something, great. Can't really rely on that though. And so they also have this complaint database, and anybody who owns a car and has a defect that they think might have safety implications can go and report that to Tesla. I mean, not to Tesla, excuse me, to NHTSA.
NHTSA.
Yeah.
Because of course. Yeah. Because of course.
But then if you sign a non-disclosure agreement, you can't. And I think that sort of this is all. And anyway, so I wrote this story. I had a quote from NHTSA, and they said this is unacceptable. They have to stop doing it. They made them stop doing it. And Tesla responded not by saying, hey, that was a mistake, and like, thanks for pointing it out, and we need to do better or something like that. They called me a short. Well, they said they made up the story. They said that I was trying to prove that there was a specific suspension defect, which I said in the piece. I'm not an engineer. I can't prove that. That's up to NHTSA. And so basically they twisted my story and made me out to be someone who makes stuff up, and because I'm short the stock, or that I work for people who short the stock. Right. And of course they made that up. They've never presented any evidence to suggest why that is, or why they think that, and it's not true. It's
the brush that every Tesla critic is tarred with immediately, and not just by Tesla, but by the Tesla fans, the Tesla owners. I mean, there really is a cadre of Tesla owners who they don't want to hear it. They stand by Elon, regardless. So let's just make it reminds me a little bit of a cult. It's like Scientology. If they have a PR problem, they do bad things to get rid of the PR problem instead of fixing the problem.
They like to go on the offensive. Yeah, and like that, especially in that 2015, 2016, even 2017 time period leading up to the Model 3, a lot of the stories I was writing, I was really trying to emphasize that, like, look, you may be getting away with this right now. This may not be the end of the world to the kinds of people that you're selling cars to right now, which are usually, well-off people, mostly in the tech sector, or people who really are into the idea of high technology and they want to be on the cutting edge. Those people, if their Tesla breaks down, they'll take the Lexus into work or whatever.
Yeah, it's exactly. I took the Audi A8 into work. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but when you get into the mass market, it's a very different kind of market. And ironically, I think people who aren't familiar with the business, they think, well, if you spend $100,000 in a car, you expect more of it. And you do in certain ways. You expect that it says something about you, or looks a certain way or performs a certain way. But really, in terms of what makes a car hard to make well, the cheapest cars are the ones that the customers rely on the most. And so, and you also build them in bigger volume, and so there's more opportunities to go wrong. That combination of having more things that can go wrong and having customers who are less tolerant when things go wrong is just not well adapted for, Tesla has not adapted themselves to that. And so, like, I was writing these stories saying, listen, you may be getting away with this now, but when you get the Model 3 out there and you're trying to sell cars at $35,000, $40,000, it's even there, which is not cheap, that there's going to be a different kind of buyer, and you need to start taking, the service really and the quality are the two main, and they're interrelated, because quality's bad, then service gets swamped, right? And that's exactly the problem that we've seen. And instead of, at the time saying, oh yeah, we are getting into a different market, we need to be doing this, or we are, or like we taking this seriously and we embrace this kind of, criticism, which again, it's constructive. I wasn't trying to tear them down. It was because I actually do agree with generally what they're trying to accomplish. And instead they attack and they make you out to be terrible, and they sick these hordes of people online to really just harass you.
And they'll sue you, and they'll go after you. And there's, cases of whistleblowers at the Tesla plant who, it's almost shocking how they've been smeared and attacked. Yeah, so, it is. And yet, everybody I've talked to as a Model 3 loves it.
Yeah.
The customer satisfaction on the Model 3 is very, very high.
Yeah, well, they also measure that within 3 days of you buying it. So
okay, that's true.
That's what sources have told me. If I'm wrong, Tesla, please, get some information out there.
But my own empirical, which is not my anecdotal measurements, are people really love their Model 3s. And, just the way I love my Model X, it was kind of like you're buying into it. You're buying into the fantasy. And you can't say, well, there's problems. Because then you're in a way you're impugning your own judgment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And they are great cars. I mean, like if just as something to drive and to have fun driving and to experience as a piece of technology,
it's so much fun to drive a Tesla.
It really is a great car to drive. It's actually, that was the thing that surprised me the most, because the S and the X they're okay, they're fast, but they're not like, for me anyway, I prefer more of like a good handling car. And the Model 3 handles really well.
Yeah.
I also just don't think like the design is necessarily, I like it personally, but
it's pretty minimalist.
I don't think it's mass market. Yeah, it's not what most people are looking for in a car. But so they have this support that's like, sort of really, really deep, but not very wide, right?
Okay. I have to say, when they started taking pre-orders for the Model 3, the $1,000 deposit for the Model 3. And in day one, it's 100,000 and 200,000. I think it got to over 300,000, like billions of dollars.
Got almost 500,000.
500,000.
Or 475, I think.
And that was what, 2015?
2016.
16. Yep. At that point, I said, they turned the corner. Elon's secret plan paid off. Mm-hmm. They have an $18 billion kitty now to become a real car company. That's not quite what happened.
It is not quite what happened. And ironically, it was that success that made you think, wow, maybe the corner has been turned, that actually ended up being their undoing in a way. It was the combination of that success and sort of the hubris that's always been a part of Tesla. Basically, they had a really, really ambitious manufacturing plan to build 500,000 by 2020. And that's a really ambitious ramp. And when those orders came in, Elon apparently thought, this is it. Like we have arrived, right? We've made it. And now we need to be able to really do something revolutionary with manufacturing. And they brought a high-tech approach to this, which is like, let's make a quantum leap, right? Let's do this alien dreadnought where it's all robots and it's moving so fast, a human couldn't even be part of the production process and all this stuff. And, these are things that like car companies talked about in the 1980s, and even General Motors tried building a super automated plant in Flint, Michigan. That did not work out well then, and the technology has not changed enough. And fundamentally, manufacturing is not a good fit with the high-tech sector, because big quantum leaps don't really happen in manufacturing. It's a fundamentally, iterative thing. And that's why the Toyota production system, one of the core principles is Kaizen, which just means continuous improvement. And it means that everybody who's part of this system improves their part a little bit every day. And collectively, because of the scale of the operation, all of those tiny little improvements really can create some like amazing advancements. But it's not sort of get a bunch of really smart, creative people together and feed them a lot of Red Bull and like they'll hackathon their way, to something that's just way better. And so what happened was Tesla ended up spending, it's hard to find it, billions of dollars, right? They've raised $4.5 billion since 2016 that where they explicitly said they're trying to get to 500,000 units. They still haven't made to 500,000 units. They say they won't until they have this new factory in China. And it's because they got way too ambitious and they literally built 2 assembly lines that like kind of don't work.
Yeah. And
they had to build the one in the tent. And ironically, the one in the tent they had to pull it together so fast, it ended up being less automated than they even were before. It's extremely dependent on manual labor, which is now supposedly what they're doing in China. And so, to me, that's just such a great lesson in the auto industry, right? If you teach, you treat it like, you can just hackathon your way through this and make these quantum leaps, you end up actually going backwards. And that's what Tesla did. And they really, because of hubris, they really squandered a historic opportunity with the Model 3. And frankly, now with service problems and persistent quality problems, they're kind of continuing to. And I think it's because they're just not set up to be a mass market car company.
So it's possible, isn't it, that you're a traditional car guy. You know, that's your background. You covered traditional car companies. And what Musk is trying to do is visionary and different. And so their position would be, well, you car guys won't get it because we're not going to do things the way they used to be done.
Yeah.
And you have to admit, not just with Tesla, but with SpaceX, that Elon's crazy hubris and willingness to be just out of the box. And often I think it's because he thinks we're in a simulation and it doesn't matter. But whatever it is, maybe it's the drugs he's taking, I don't know, is to some that is the Silicon Valley way. That is to some degree what made Silicon Valley a success. Isn't it possible that the best way to do a new car company wouldn't be the way GM and Ford and Toyota did it, but to do it the way Silicon Valley did it?
Well, I think for a premium brand, yeah. If you only want to sell,
so his mistake is to be it's trying to be a mass market company.
Yes, that really is the fundamental mistake. And again, I think that's I really tried to not make this book about Elon Musk. My background is the auto industry, or at least covering the auto industry, and that's what I know, and that's what I tried to really focus on covering. I think that if you look at the history, which is what the book does, it shows that from the very beginning and at every step, they've not fully understood and underestimated the challenge of what they were getting into.
But that's very Silicon Valley.
It is.
When Steve Jobs said, we're going to do a smartphone, that first iPhone prototype he demonstrated on stage barely worked.
Yeah.
It was not a product.
Yep.
And that's very Silicon Valley. And the Silicon Valley motto is fail fast, right? And and move forward.
Right. And so if you have a product that the manufacturing is nimble enough, and most importantly, that the margins are high enough on, then you can sort of make it work, right? Which is why I think, if you have a small volume, manufacturing and you're selling really, really, like instead of bringing their prices down, Tesla should be breaking their prices up. They should be doing special Elon signature editions for like $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. Seriously.
Yeah. Because Jason Calacanis would buy it.
That exactly. And there's a lot of people who would buy that. And I think that's how they could make money. And guess what? That's more of what they've been doing than what they originally planned on doing.
I bought the bioweapon defense mode. Because Elon said it would be great if you ever had a mustard gas attack. I don't need that. I spent a lot of money on that, but I also knew in my head, A, it's cool because it's got that bioweapon logo, and B, I'm putting money into Tesla to support this vision of an electric future. And I think you're right. I think there's still people that do that. I probably would do that. But it has to be a car that I can drive.
That you can rely on.
That I can rely on.
Yeah.
And if they lose that. Now, it's probably too recent to have gotten into your book, but what your book does talk about J.B. Straubel, who is an interesting fella because he doesn't get any credit. Nobody knows his name. Yeah. But he's the CTO at Tesla. He's considered what? Well, that's the news, right? He was considered to be the guy, really the genius behind the whole thing. Left he sold $3 million in stock and then left about a week ago. What is that? Tell me what that means. You talk about JB in the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, I think that J.B. Straubel was really important in building one of the key technological, assets that Tesla has, which is their drivetrain technology. And he really, brought that from being something that, AC propulsion has sort of created the original drivetrain that they were going to sort of use for the Roadster, but it was like literally handmade, hand-tuned, no documentation, no nothing. And so, J.B. Straubel basically and his folks, sort of, took those beginnings, but really, really made it into what is clearly industry-leading electric drivetrain technology. And
see, that's what gets me. This stuff is innovative. This stuff is amazing.
So I think to understand this problem, you have to think about successful car companies. And, Toyota is pretty clearly the most successful car company of the last 50 years. And they went from being a loom company, they made looms for weaving. They got into the car business, really, in the really mostly just since World War II. I mean, they started before then, but Toyotas have never been the sexiest cars. They've never been the fastest cars. They've never been the highest tech cars. In fact, on a lot of those things, they've been very conservative. And yet they've become they're always in the top 3 in terms of sales and in terms of sales volume, and they're always profitable.
Best car ever owned was a Lexus. Best car ever owned.
And I think what that lesson shows is that, we have, as humans, we have this really, and some of us more than others, there's an emotional connection to cars. Some have it more than others, and people have it. There's different variations of that emotional connection, and but that's a really important part of cars. But also, I think what that can help us lose sight of, and that's why people like Tesla, is Tesla reflects their personality or their image that they think of themselves. Maybe you're a computer programmer, and that's the car that reminds you of programming or the place that tech holds in the world now, right? It's very symbolic. But at the end of the day,
the Tesla screen has asteroids on it. My God, it's an arcade and a car.
Yeah. So I think what Toyota shows is that these things that are important for premium cars, that's its own thing, and that what works in the mass market is it just has to be well made, reliable, and affordable. It's a utility, right? You are buying the ability to get from point A to point B whenever you want, as simply and drama-free as possible.
Yeah.
Drama-free
is not the word you'd apply to Tesla manufacturing.
Yeah, drama magnet. I think Elon called that one.
Is Elon's personality part of the problem?
Yeah. So again, I really didn't want this book to be about Elon Musk. I wanted it to be about Tesla, but I think you can't separate the two. And I think that, that moment in 2000 and
he even said, you quote an anecdote where Elon said, "We're not building Toyotas."
Yep. And he, in 2006, when he put himself at the center of this, because the media coverage had not been making him out to be the genius behind all this, we've seen that trend continue, and Tesla has become more and more and more about Elon Musk ever since. And I think part of that dynamic has been that nobody, right? We've seen how they treat critics outside the company. I've certainly seen it. Many others have as well. But that same dynamic exists inside the company. If Elon says something, that's what's going to happen, and there is nobody who can put a check on him. And I think J.B. Straubel was maybe one of the people who could have. And so this is manifest in a lot of ways, right? This kind of dynamic is how you get to a point where, the funding secured thing happened, where he just said this stuff that wasn't true.
A tweet that cost him $20 million.
The lawyers couldn't stop him because he doesn't listen to lawyers. He doesn't hire lawyers who don't say, yeah, Elon, go for it. So I think that making and again, I think, it also ties into the mass market ambitions. He wanted that not because the mass market is where you make a lot of money. It was this grand messianic vision, which ultimately, he wanted to be at the center of. And I think, people say, what is Tesla about? Is he a fraudster? Is he this or that? I think a lot of what Tesla is about him feeling good about himself and about feeling good about how people see him. And I think there's a lot of points where you can look at decisions that have been made about that company that have been very momentous and they were maybe the right choice for Elon, but they weren't necessarily the right choice for Tesla.
It must be a moment in our history where these kinds of people rise up, because that sounds very much like the guy in the White House. Is JB leaving a bad sign?
Yeah, so it's part of a I mean, clearly someone who is that brilliant and who has made those kinds of contributions to their core drivetrain technology. Clearly, that's not ideal. I think the most worrying part of it is that it's yet another relationship that has not gone the distance at Tesla. And the car business is a relationship business. It's like I call it the ultimate team sport, because no one person, and this is why you don't see people like Elon Musk in the car industry. And this is why he's so dynamic and so exciting to people. Is like, whoa, there's a guy in the car business who makes cars, but he's also larger than life and exciting. And it's because it's a team sport, right? You have to work together. And a big part of that is relationships with companies, that are your suppliers, right? And we've seen basically almost every supplier that Tesla has worked with in a serious way, certainly Mobileye, which helped them get autopilot off the ground at a certain point, that relationship blew up.
We don't need them anymore. Yeah.
And now what we're seeing now, what's really scary now is that I'm not saying that his relationship with JB Straubel blew up, but JB Straubel's leaving. That's another guy who's not at Tesla anymore. And then Panasonic.
They make the batteries.
They make the batteries, and it's Tesla's longest lasting, I think, supplier relationship, one of them certainly, and clearly the most important one. And JB Straubel was the point man.
Oh boy.
And so we've seen signs that relationship is not going well already leading up to JB Straubel's departure. It's very hard to be optimistic about that relationship now, but it's also like, what does Tesla do without their battery supplier?
Well, they built. You're actually in Nevada right now. They built the Gigafactory. Isn't that going to fix the problem?
So the Gigafactory, Tesla built the building. There are parts inside of it. So Panasonic basically rents.
It's really
space.
A Panasonic factory.
The cells that make up the battery. So there's battery cells, right? And then there's battery packs. Tesla assembles the cells into packs there. But
the weirdest
Panasonic
thing ever. And I was at the Tesla factory when I picked up my Model X. They're using the same, what are they, the 8650 cells that you see in laptops, that you see everywhere.
18650, yeah.
18650. They just put a lot of them together. Of them together. And those are Panasonic parts.
Yeah. And the reason they did that is because they thought that battery technology was going to change all the time.
Yeah.
And that these cells were the first sort of format that new chemistries come out in. And they're also high volume, and so they'd be cheaper, and you get the new chemistry sooner. And ironically, we actually haven't, since Tesla was founded, there haven't been major breakthroughs in lithium-ion battery chemistry.
Yeah, and that's not Tesla's fault.
Oh no, it's not. But just for contrast, the other automakers use like prismatic and like flat pouch cells because they think it's easier to package.
They pack better. A round cylinder is not an efficient to pack it.
And it's very complicated to make. And there have been all kinds of challenges with the manufacturing aspects of that,
I really want Tesla not only to survive, but to win. But you're right. When I think of, for instance, Ford and their former CEO, Alan Mulally, a complete opposite of Elon Musk. A guy who works well with people, who's smart but quiet, who doesn't get a lot of headlines. Does Tesla have a shot?
That's a complicated question to answer. Look, they have everything they need to have a extremely durable, small volume, premium.
There's a path forward, but it's not the path they're taking.
Exactly. So they need to stop with this, and I think the scary part, right, is that, and we haven't really talked about the stock, but like a lot of what they've been doing is also making decisions that are good for their stock, but not necessarily good for the company. And this sort of emphasis on hyper growth, that's a story that the investors buy. And so the stock goes up. And of course, that's good for Elon too, because he owns a lot of the stock. But sort of constantly growing at breakneck speed is also just not a good way to run a car business. And especially one that's sort of has the culture that Tesla has now. And after 15 years, your culture is what it is. It's not going to turn around overnight. But the question is, can Tesla sort of walk away from this story that they're going to just keep growing until they sell like every car in the world? I don't know. I mean, it
they may be trapped. They may be trapped by market expectations.
Yeah, that's the scary thing because at the core, they've got great technology, and they got great design. They've got a lot of things that will make the first sort of, new premium car brand of the 21st century. I mean, they deserve to be that. They have that. It's just the hubris that doesn't let them be happy with that and doesn't let them see that they've had this profound impact on cars and the market and the industry without having to sell millions of cars.
They had a very bad quarter. They're losing a lot of money, but they're sitting on a decent amount of cash. They're not going to run out of money tomorrow. They've got the Model Y coming next year. They're working on a truck. You think they should put that stuff on the back burner and just try to make a better Model 3?
Yeah. I mean, so they have the Roadster and the Semi and like a pickup truck and a Model Y that I think are all basically supposed to come out next year. I think the Semi's been pushed back or whatever. But yeah, there's too much going on there. You have to focus on something. I think making a Model Y makes sense because it uses the Model 3 parts. Basically it's a very high parts commonality, which the Model X did not have, which is why the Model X was a disaster. One of the reasons it was a disaster. So I think the Roadster makes sense for them because that gets them back into that really high price,
the high
cutting
end
edge. Yeah, pushing the technology forward. That's not something that mass market car makers do. You have to do it in small volumes in order to really, really push.
It's kind of their R8.
That's what they're good at. Yeah. Well, but it's even a higher thing. So honestly, though, I think the really scary thing for Tesla, and we haven't had a lot of time to talk about this, is the autonomous vehicle, the full self-driving thing. I think that they are. And by the way, I have a podcast that's one of the bigger autonomous vehicle podcasts. I talk to people in sector all the time. I'm not just a metal bending guy. And I think that they are selling something that they can't deliver. And I think that it is already proving to be corrosive to Elon Musk's credibility, which is frankly Tesla's most important asset. And I think that that ultimately is, a lot of Tesla set itself up to be a confidence game, and I know that has associations with it. I'm not saying it's, they've always been fraudulent or whatever. I think people make some wild accusations about them, but they've certainly their stock price has depended on trust that like this guy can land a rocket on a barge, he can do whatever he says he's going to do. And the history shows that's not necessarily the case, but also just everything about autonomous drive technology and what we know about how it's being developed indicates that their entire strategy doesn't make sense, and that technically they don't have the sensors and the redundancy, a whole bunch of other things to actually make that. And so I think what the biggest challenge to Tesla right now is how do they painted themselves in this corner. Okay, maybe they deliver on it. I'm not saying there's no chance that they deliver on it, but I think that's going to make or break that company.
I feel like it was the same thing as the biological defense filter. It was a poorly named, it's basically adaptive cruise control and lane changing.
So that's autopilot.
Yeah. And they called it autopilot, which was probably poor choice. Consumer Reports says don't call it autopilot. But Elon's really gotten in trouble by basically insinuating, well, we'll have level 5 autonomy next year, and soon Tesla owners will be able to rent out their cars and make money on their cars because it'll just drive people around. And
he's not insinuating it. He's saying
it. It's a fairy tale.
Taking people's money. It is. It is a fairy tale. And I think that it shows, right, that like he has this relationship with his fans where they just want to believe that he's magical.
We do.
Yeah. And so, they're going to have to figure out how that works. Like,
I believe he's magical, but I never took my hands off the wheel.
Yeah.
And I disengaged all the time.
Yep.
I never treated it like, I could take a nap. And it's irresponsible to imply that you could.
Yeah, and I think there's even technical aspects to it, right? So it doesn't have a driver monitoring system. Like Cadillac Super Cruise, there hasn't been a single crash, let alone a fatality.
Because it's watching you. It's looking at you.
It's watching you. And if you're not paying attention to the road, it doesn't let you use the system.
I tested it because I covered my eyes. I had to peek because I thought this is crazy. And the seat starts going like this. And I mean, this is how it should be.
Yep. And Elon just said, there were engineers who told the Wall Street Journal, well, it was because of cost. Right. They didn't want to add more cost. And of course, Elon Musk said, no, it's because the technology doesn't really work. And I'm like, wait a second. Like, you're this, you can land rockets on ships, but you can't make eye tracking, camera software work. Like,
there's a fine balance because you do have to sell the vision, right? There is this, you do have to be a salesman.
But I think you put the finger on it, is he was selling the vision. And what autopilot always was sort of like, so in 2013, Google had to offer to buy them. And it wasn't until after that where they canceled the deal because they paid off the government loan. Their stock went crazy, and they said, we don't need you, Google, anymore. But like right after that, that's when Elon started talking about autopilot.
Yeah.
And if you look back at what he said, it was about, well, we can do about 90% of what Google's going to do with stuff that we can just put on the car now and that you can afford. Whereas Google is saying it's going to be, really expensive cars and you're just going to have to share them. And so he has sold the appearance of autonomous drive, a simulacrum of autonomy. And he's walked this line between, at first it was like self-driving cars are here. When that first launched, there were all these headlines about self-driving cars are here. And then when people started to die, then it was like, oh, no, it's actually just a driver assistance system. And the story's constantly changing. But you'll notice that once they had to start saying, oh, no, it's just a driver assist system, that's when they said, okay, in 2016, starting now, every car has the hardware for full self-driving. And if you pay us
$5,000 for something that doesn't exist.
That's what makes their business, to the extent that their business works, it's that profit from from software basically that they still haven't even delivered.
3 years I had a Model X and never once used Summon. I didn't dare. I didn't want it. I didn't know what's going to happen.
I mean,
you press a button, the car comes out of your garage and pulls up and says, "Get in." I'm not going to use. I didn't even use the auto park, and that's a well understood technology in many vehicles. But I didn't even use that.
Yeah, but it also doesn't work well in Tesla. I mean, Tesla doesn't even have like good blind spot monitoring.
The sensors are terrible. The Falcon Wing kept hitting my wife.
Yeah,
we actually got to the point where we said, she said, "Look, you may not close the doors until you say, 'Is everybody inside? Are your hands and feet inside the vehicle? I am now closing the doors, okay?'"
Yeah.
Twice it hit her in the head.
Better blind spot monitoring, which I think is a fantastic, driver assistance system. You get a better one in a $15,000,
absolutely,
Toyota Corolla.
I get the top-down camera. I can see what's all around me. Yeah, no, absolutely. By the way, the podcast, Ed's podcast, is called Autonocast. It's at autonocast.com.
Autonocast,
Yep. And I think this is a fascinating subject, but we are farther off than anybody admits, don't you think?
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing is that, well, so now most autonomous drive development companies are admitting that it's farther off, and they're dialing back their deadlines or their target dates for deployment, and they're talking down all this sort of hypey rhetoric. Yeah. And the one exception to that is Elon Musk,
of course,
and Tesla, and they are keeping their foot on that hype button, or whatever, the hype pedal. And I think that I just don't see how they can keep doing it. I don't. I mean, again, maybe maybe there is some fundamental breakthrough that nobody else in the sector, because it's not just me. My opinions on autonomous drive technology obviously don't come from personal experience. They come from talking to people who are working in this space. And of course, every Tesla fan says, "Oh, well, they're a competitor, so of course they're going to say he sucks." And like, there's not a situation where 85-90% of people in one business all are like, "No, that guy is crazy." Like that. That's not just random talking about your competitors.
But at the same time, I think Elon justifies it in his mind. You got to think big. You got to put. This is the Silicon Valley way, and I think this is what you talk about throughout the book, and what really the thesis is. There's cars, and then there's Silicon Valley, and the Silicon Valley way, which is to talk big. We're going to have that next year. But that's not a vehicle that's transporting people at 60 miles an hour down a freeway. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect. Yep. And I understand that.
And like a Ferrari, if you buy a Ferrari, and it breaks or whatever, it's okay. It goes with the territory. You're buying something that's on the cutting edge. Yeah. But if you're replacing your Honda Accord with a Model 3, then that's when you get the problem.
So you've heard bad things about the Chevy Bolt? I'm curious now. I'm worried.
No.
We've only had it a couple of months.
I haven't heard bad things.
I love it. I'm a Tesla owner who loves, but I tell you what, I don't want to ever buy another gas vehicle. I think I love electric cars. We put solar panels, Solar City, thank you, Elon, on the roof. I came real close to buying the big battery pack, but I haven't done that yet. But I like the idea that I'm plugging the car into electricity I've generated.
Yep.
I
hear a lot. It generally speaking, people who who have owned Teslas very rarely say like, oh, I really like this other electric car.
I see what you're saying.
I think, like you say, people get their identity wrapped up in Tesla and Elon Musk and this mystique, and it becomes very hard to say, well, actually, I really just want a car that gets me from point A to point B, and if it's not the sexiest, most cutting edge thing ever, then that's kind of not the end of the world to me. That's a tough transition to make, so I admire your ability to be pragmatic about cars, because there are, like I said, there's that emotional component and that image component, and then there's just the reality of this is a tool that I use in certain ways. I'm
not saying I'm not getting in line to buy a Porsche Taycan. I'm not saying that.
That's an attractive car.
That's what's changing, though, isn't it? I mean, Elon owned this market for years. When I bought my Tesla 3 years ago, I was just me. Tesla owners would wave at each other because we were rare. I see Model 3s everywhere in Northern California, everywhere, all the time. There's 3 in our parking lot right now. So that's changing. I'm seeing more and more electric vehicles from traditional manufacturers. In a couple of years, Tesla's not going to be anything special.
Yeah, that's the one of the risks, right? If they don't blow themselves up with this full self-driving thing or something like that, that the risk is, competition is coming. Tesla fans like to say, the Jaguar I-Pace, the Audi e-tron, they don't have as long a range. They look at the things that Tesla does best and they say, well, we haven't beaten them at the things they do best.
Right.
And the reality is that that's not how competition works. The opportunity that the competitors have are the people maybe like you who loved everything about the design and the engineering of the Tesla, but did not like the quality problems and did not like the service issues and the time it took to get stuff repaired.
I was just worried. I didn't have any problems. I was just worried. Klaus Selmer, the CEO of Porsche, says that almost all the pre-orders for the Porsche Taycan electric vehicle are from Tesla owners.
Oh, absolutely. And it's even, I think anybody who can put out a car that's 80% as good as a Tesla in terms of like speed and performance and range and all that kind of stuff, if it's only 80% as good on all those things, but it's got the reliability of a mainstream
from a
real
metal
car,
bender. Yeah.
At the end of the day, that's what people are going to gravitate towards.
Yeah. Plus, the Porsche badge kind of does have a certain cachet.
It sure does. Yeah, it goes back a ways.
Great book. Really interesting topic. And you had a lot of sources. You have to point out at the beginning, nobody would let me use their name because everybody's terrified of Elon's retribution. But I think this is the honestly most balanced book I've read. We had Ashley Vance on when his book on Tesla came out, which is also another great read. But this is much more up to date and fascinating. Ludicrous, the unvarnished story of Tesla Motors. And we just scratched the surface. There's lots to talk about in this. If you want more of Ed's insight, don't forget the Autonocast, which is his autonomous vehicle podcast at autonocast.com.
I'm also senior editor at thedrive.com.
At thedrive.com. Don't forget.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't mention that.
No,
earlier.
it's fine. Thank you.
Really a pleasure having you on, Ed, and a great subject. Thank you. And I'll keep you posted on my experiences with other EV vehicles. Because, honestly, I probably will never again buy a Tesla. Maybe the Model Y, but probably not. You make the perfect point, which is this is not a toy. This is how I get to work.
Yeah.
And it has to be reliable. I have to be able to get it repaired. I have to know that the motor isn't their best effort, that it actually works.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. It makes me so glad to hear that people want to hear both sides of this, because if you're on Twitter, you don't always get that feedback.
Or Reddit is worse, And I follow all the electric vehicle and the Tesla subreddits. And it's really interesting to watch the flame wars. And, people come down on one side or the other. I think you've done a great job of balancing it and trying to get to the bottom of it, as befits a good auto journalist. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Ludicrous.
This has been a lot of fun. You
can get it now on Amazon.com. We do Triangulation. We try to do it every Friday around 11:30 a.m. Pacific. That's 2:30 a.m. East Coast time. That's 17:30 UTC. If you wanted to watch it live, you just tune in. Go to twit.tv/live. You could watch or listen as we make the show. But for the most part, it's a podcast. People consume it on demand. And you can absolutely do that. Just go to our website, twit.tv, in this case, twit.tv/TRI. It's on YouTube. You can, and actually the best thing to do is get your favorite podcast applications and subscribe, and that way you'll get it. Because every week it's something different, something interesting. Some of them, I think, the biggest brains in technology, the most interesting stories. So I hope you will come back each and every week for another Triangulation. Thanks. We'll see you next time.